Neurotic Literature by James Lark. This story, A Mole Tragedy. Moles are simple creatures. Their lives consist almost entirely of eating, sleeping, and burrowing, and although the routine is occasionally broken up by a bit of mating, for the most part they are solitary creatures. Even when it comes to the mating, they tend to keep the transaction as brief as possible, with little small talk and no intention of staying in touch. The male usually legs it as soon as the deed is done, so as to avoid the risk of having anything to do with children that might result from the union. There is not a lot about this that human observers would conventionally find appealing, but a friendly pink snout goes a long way to mitigate the impact of this behaviour on the mole's reputation. It is also fair to say that some humans carry on in much the same way, even whilst managing to maintain a veneer of respectability in spite of the absence of a friendly pink snout. I'm inclined to consider the humble mole more dependable than any of these people. That said, I probably wouldn't go to a mole for advice about relationships. There was a pair of moles who bucked the trend and decided to stick it out for longer. Their names were Bernard and Frida, and they met one day whilst burrowing. Well, specifically, they met while Bernard was emitting high-pitched squeals in the hope of attracting a random hookup. But love finds you when you're least expecting, doesn't it? Bernard and Frida were surprised to find that they had a great deal in common. A shared love of eating, sleeping, and burrowing, for starters, and the mating turned out to be quite fun as well. So much did they enjoy each other's company that once the obligatory matter was dealt with, Bernard felt no urgency in making the customary post-coital escape, and Frida was quite content to let him stay. Un-mole-like though this behaviour was, they spent the next few days happily collaborating on all of the things that moles like doing, eating, sleeping, and burrowing mainly, and having established such a successful rapport, it seemed silly to end it. They didn't exactly decide to spend the rest of their lives together, it just sort of happened. Mindful of the fact that she had entered not just an unexpected long-term relationship, but also a gestation period, Frida dug out a little nursery, and though she was perfectly capable of doing this alone, such was his devotion that Bernard helped line it with grass and leaves. Here it was that Frida gave birth to a litter of 2 babies, pink and blind, and both as beautiful as children always are to their parents, even if baby moles are, objectively, about as ugly as babies get. They named the babies Jane and Derek. Feeding on their mother's milk, the young moles grew in the ways that moles do, developing fur, opening their eyes, and eventually maturing to full size, at which point they were ready to go out into the world to burrow for themselves. So it was that Jane left the little leaf-lined chamber, bid her parents and brother farewell, and dug her way to a future of eating, sleeping, burrowing, and, with any luck, some eventual mating. Derek did not leave the chamber. Though he was fully grown and eating solid food, though he was more than capable of fending for himself and burrowing in the isolated way that other moles do, he looked around his little hole and decided that it was a pretty comfortable place to stay put for the time being. Besides which, he didn't much like the idea of burrowing. Bernard and Frida were surprised to discover that Derek was still hanging around, but being unconventionally companionable themselves, they were not overly bothered by his presence. "He'll go when he's ready," Frida said. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks started to threaten to turn into months, they became increasingly alarmed that their son was showing no inclination to move any further from the leaf-lined chamber that really had been built only for his infancy. "Maybe he won't go," admitted Frida. "After all, you hung around when I wasn't expecting you to, and you're still here." "This is hardly a comparable situation," said Bernard. So he confronted Derek. "Isn't it about time you went out and made some burrows of your own?" he asked.
"I like this one," said Derek. "It's cosy."
This response caused Bernard and Frida some considerable concern. Of even more concern was the fact that, although Bernard and Frida dug into the earth each day, burrowing with the enthusiasm that was typical for a mole, Derek never seemed to want to get involved. He preferred to stay, as he put it, alone with his thoughts. "Thoughts? What thoughts?" asked Bernard.
"Just thoughts,"
his son would reply.
"I wonder where we went wrong,"
wondered Frida.
"We've been setting a good example with our burrowing, haven't we?"
Nevertheless, whenever they asked him to help them burrow, Derek told his parents that he was too busy and didn't want to. They decided that they were going to have a serious talk with him. "Derek," Bernard called, "your mother and I would like to have a serious talk with you." Derek sighed. It was not a convenient time. He had been sitting in his leaf-lined chamber trying to compose a poem about what it was like to be a mole. He had only written the first couple of stanzas, and he wasn't altogether happy with those.
"What beyond the darkness lies? What sights would be consumed above the labyrinthine holes in which we are entombed? What happy-making joys of life in heaven's rain and chills? Would we leave our cares behind like little muddy hills?"
He was worried because he had, almost instinctively, made it rhyme, and Derek knew that real poetry, especially modern poetry, did not rhyme. But he had been too cowardly to write blank verse, and instead what he had intended to be a profound and nihilistic expression of his existence came across like a vulgar song lyric that might as well be articulated with the high-pitched squeals that moles emit to attract a mate, the closest thing moles have to pop music. He also felt that his words had inadequately expressed something that he hadn't entirely intended to express in the first place. It was the second quatrain in particular that bothered him. As well as the clumsy syntax, he was cringing at his use of the cliché "joys of life," which carried an optimism entirely contrary to the mood he had set out to suggest. Furthermore, he was painfully aware that, were his short limbs capable of holding a pencil and writing his poem down, he would be completely at a loss as to how to spell labyrinthine. "Derek!" His father's call carried his thoughts away from such difficulties and back to the world of the burrow in which he lived. Derek reluctantly decided to abandon his musings for a while, if only for the sake of diplomacy. He shuffled into the main part of the tunnel where his father and mother were waiting for him. He looked at their serious faces and prepared for the discussion that was to follow. He had a nasty feeling that he knew what it was going to be about. "Derek." His father cleared his throat, and there was an uncomfortable pause. Derek's mother was the next to speak.
"We love you very much, Derek, and we're very proud of you."
"No, we're not," Bernard disagreed. "He hasn't done anything to be proud of." Frida gave her partner a disappointed glance. "Yet," Bernard added. "Hasn't done anything to be proud of, yet."
"And you will," said Frida. "Soon. It's just—"
She stopped, looking at Bernard for support. Another awkward pause followed.
"Well," she continued, "we're concerned that you never seem to want to do any burrowing."
Derek fixed his parents with his small, dark eyes.
"I don't like burrowing," he said.
"What? That's nonsense. Why not?" his father demanded.
"I don't like getting dirt stuck in my claws,"
Derek replied. His father paused, taken aback by this answer. "You don't expect me to believe a silly excuse like that, do you?" he finally asked.
"But it's true."
Derek met his father's indignant frown with a calm stare.
"I don't like the feeling of having dirt and stones building up underneath my claws."
Derek looked from one bewildered parent to another and sighed inwardly. This wasn't such a difficult concept to understand, was it?
"It makes them ache," he explained, And once the dirt is there, it's impossible to get out. It's not as if we have particularly good cleaning facilities down here.
"You're a mole," his father burst out angrily. "You have to put up with having dirt under your claws."
I don't have to put up with it if I don't burrow.
"You can't choose not to burrow."
Of course I can.
"No, you can't. For a start, you have to burrow for food."
What, with a diet consisting mostly of earthworms?
Derek asked.
Gosh, I wonder where I might possibly find earthworms without burrowing living down here in the earth.
He pulled an earthworm out of the earth next to him.
Oh, look, found one.
"That's cheating," spluttered Bernard. "We go looking for worms. We don't let the worms come to us."
It all tastes the same.
"Anyway," Derek added, lazily tossing the worm away,
I'm thinking of becoming a vegetarian.
"A what?"
Not very humane, is it? The way we paralyse worms with toxins in our saliva. I'm going to have a go at living on bits of leaves and stuff.
"You can't do that." But he could, and from that day onwards, he did. Bernard was angry for reasons he couldn't even begin to express, and Frida was deeply worried that their son was going to get impossibly thin. But somehow Derek managed on a plant-based diet. Or at least, if he did indulge in the occasional centipede, then it was only ever as a treat, and he certainly didn't go paralysing insects with his toxic saliva.
After all, he said to himself, we're all living creatures, aren't we?
In the meantime, Bernard and Frida continued to insist that burrowing was simply a thing he needed to do, and the sooner he stopped putting it off, the better. "Moles have to burrow," Bernard explained. "It's what we do."
We don't have to do anything,
Derek disagreed.
That's the whole point of free will. If we all burrow because everybody thinks we have to, then nobody is really doing anything that they want to. Our whole life simply becomes one meaningless duty.
"Meaningless?" Bernard exploded. "My father burrowed, and his father burrowed, and his father's father burrowed, just as I have spent my life burrowing, and just as you," he gave Derek a look that would have terrified most young moles, "are going to come and burrow with me now."
No, I'm not.
Derek was not like most young moles. He was not easy to intimidate, especially when he knew he was in the right. But Derek's father did not like to be argued with, especially by a son who was so clearly trying to evade his responsibilities. Derek's mother, seeing the direction the argument was likely to take, nervously intervened. "It's ever such a lot of work for me and your father to keep burrowing without your help." Derek gave her a withering look.
As if moles normally help their parents to burrow. Most children would have left home by now, as you well know.
"Yes, to burrow," said Bernard.
"But it makes no difference to you whether I'm off somewhere else burrowing and not helping, or sitting here not burrowing and not helping."
"Well, no, except—" began Frida, flustered because she knew her son was wrong, but he had confused her with a sentence that made it sound as though he wasn't. And while listening to that, she seemed to have lost track of the words she needed to explain the situation to him. "Because you're here, Derek, because you're here, and we're there, we end up burrowing for 3. That wasn't quite it, but it was close enough, she thought, and surely even Derek couldn't argue with her logic.
"Stop burrowing, then," Derek told her.
"We can't stop burrowing, don't you understand?" Bernard shouted.
"No, I do not understand."
Derek was careful not to raise his voice. He would try to win this argument in a civilized manner. "We have to keep burrowing, dear," Frida said, her eyes silently pleading with him to be a little more cooperative, "because if we didn't, we'd be stuck in the same place the whole time."
"Why don't we stay in the same place, then?" Derek suggested. "I'm quite happy where we are."
At this, Derek's father began snorting in rage, and Derek quickly continued,
"If you stayed here, you could stop burrowing and do other things instead."
"Other things?" Bernard repeated incredulously. "Like what? What is it that you do all by yourself while your mother and I are doing all the work?"
"I think of things. I make things up in my head."
"Oh, really?" Derek's father laughed sarcastically. "So, what have you got to show for all your thinking, eh? We've got all these tunnels and our burrows, that's what we've achieved. What have you achieved, ever?" Derek considered reciting his incomplete poem, but decided against it. It hadn't even come close to fulfilling the potential of his ideas. He had started to wonder if a clever conceit might be a better way of encompassing the range of emotions he wanted to express. Besides which, even if it had worked out the way he had intended, he felt sure that his parents would not remotely understand the concept of poetry. So instead, Derek said the first thing that came into his head.
"I'll achieve something, Dad. I'll learn to play the harmonica."
Which wasn't necessarily a bad idea, but it wasn't one that was likely to please his father. It didn't.
"Harmonica?"
Bernard stared at his son for several seconds. When he eventually spoke, his voice was menacingly quiet, and he punctuated each word by jabbing at the floor with his claws. "I've heard enough of these silly ideas from you. You're a mole. Moles burrow. It's that simple. You are a mole, and you are going to burrow."
"Why accept such a narrow definition of what it is to be a mole?" Derek asked. "Moles are usually solitary, but that hasn't stopped you and Mum from staying together, has it?"
Bernard advanced on his son slightly threateningly. "Do not," he warned, "compare the precious relationship we have formed to some reckless dream about playing the harmonica."
"Yes, I suppose it is too much to expect a mind as limited as yours to make the connection,"
Derek said. Then he turned and ambled back to his leafy chamber. Bernard snarled, an uncharacteristic noise for a mole to make, but he snarled nonetheless, and was about to follow when Frida stopped him.
"Don't, Bernard," she whispered. "There's no point in shouting any more. He'll see sense soon."
Bernard looked at Frida. She was right, of course. Derek would soon learn. But more weeks passed, and Derek still refused to burrow. His parents tried cajoling him, bribing him, threatening him, but Derek remained unintimidated by such tactics, and started to learn the harmonica. "What are we going to do?" Bernard asked Frida one day, speaking loud enough to make himself heard above the noise of Derek's harmonica practice.
"There's nothing we can do that we haven't tried already,"
Frida pointed out, a note of desperation in her voice.
"He just sits there all day playing that instrument of his."
"Where did he get the bloody thing from, anyway?" Bernard asked. But Frida had no idea how any mole would find a harmonica.
"Perhaps he burrowed for it," she suggested hopefully.
Bernard snorted derisively. "He's never done a moment's burrowing in his life." He listened to Derek's harmonica playing and wondered quite how he had ended up with such a difficult son. He's a mole, for crying out loud. He's probably the only mole in the history of the world to learn to play a musical instrument.
"Don't tell him that. He'll only feel proud,"
Frida advised. They listened again to the noises emerging from Derek's corner. His playing was remarkably accomplished for a mole, although he was having some trouble mastering throat vibrato. Hardly surprising, given the structure of the mole trachea.
"He will grow out of it," Frida insisted. "He can't avoid burrowing forever."
"Do you really think so?" Bernard retorted. Doubt and anxiety showed on both of their miserable faces. The months wore on, and Derek grew older. But he did not grow out of playing the harmonica. He mastered throat vibrato and other advanced techniques, and began to compose many tunes of his own. At the same time, he began to think about what other musical instruments he might learn. Ideally, he would have chosen the cello, but he felt that even he would find it impossible to adapt his tiny body to playing such a large thing. He did, however, think that the extra thumbs that moles have would be extremely expedient in mastering the clarinet, and he made this his next objective. He had no idea about where he might find a clarinet to learn, but he did not let this cloud his ambition, for a harmonica had also once seemed like an impossible dream. If he really put his mind to it, he would find himself a clarinet. In the meantime, he started to assemble ideas for an art installation. His parents naturally knew nothing of these thoughts, and their frustration continued to grow. But it did them little good, and the more they argued with Derek, the more adamant he became that he would never burrow,
I don't like the feeling of dirt trapped under my claws, he insisted. I don't know how you can bear it. Doesn't it feel uncomfortable, pushing your nails up like that?
How the hell would you know? Bernard retorted.
That's the wonderful thing about imagination.
You won't burrow because you imagine that you won't like it?
That's right.
Burrowing isn't about imagining, it's about doing. To Derek, this was an absurd distinction. To him, imagining was doing. Or, if doing meant turning thought into physical action, it still couldn't be separated from the imaginative act. It wasn't as if he was going to leap into action putting together an art installation before imagining it first, was it? Come to that, if he imagined something sufficiently, was it all that different in perception to a thing that had found physical form? Could the brain even distinguish between perceived and imagined mental images? What was to say anything they perceived was real at all? But he thought it best not to say any of this out loud. "We should leave him," said Bernard one day. "He's too old to be depending on us."
"I'm not sure he is depending on us," said Frida.
"All the more reason not to stick around. Let him do what he wants. We have our own lives to lead." Frida looked thoughtful, then came to a decision.
"No," she said firmly. "I know that normal mole children would have left long ago, but Derek has decided to stay, and I have to think that means he still needs us, so I'll stay here for him until he doesn't."
She looked tenderly at Bernard.
"You must go, if you have to, but I can't."
It was like a vicious slap to his friendly pink snout. Bernard had given up everything. The ease of solitary burrowing, the thrill of random, consequence-free breeding. Yet here was Frida choosing their useless son over him. Enough. He was going to force his son to burrow, even if it meant he had to get physical. The boy needed to burrow, and once he started, he would see how foolish he was being and leave home like a normal mole. Only then would things get back to how they used to be, just Bernard and Frida, like the old days. "You're coming with me," he told Derek firmly.
"I can't come now, I'm in the middle of practicing my clarinet," Derek said.
"You'll come now, even if I have to force you," Bernard shouted. "It's about time you did something constructive."
"This is constructive," Derek countered.
"That?" Bernard gestured angrily at the clarinet. "You call that constructive? Wasting your time making noise when you could be burrowing, building a home, making tunnels, things that will last. You could be building whole structures. What have you ever built with your instruments?"
"I build tunes. I take notes and I put them together in different ways to fashion the most complex structures that can exist. Out of nothing, I create sounds that are more real and solid than anything else, sounds that function on so many more different levels than anything physical could. My tunes," he unsympathetically declared, "will last for much longer than your tunnels."
How Bernard would have responded to this is mere conjecture, for at that moment Frida dashed into the burrow, her nose quivering in panic. "Gas!" she said. Bernard instantly began to claw at the ground. "Burrow for your lives!" he ordered. Derek sniffed the air. Gifted not only with the hypersensitive faculty for smell that was part and parcel of being a mole, but also with a smattering of scientific knowledge that was, amongst his species, distinctly unique to him, he could identify the gas as phosphine. He played a sad little tune on his clarinet, musing that, if the above-land dwellers were so inconvenienced by his being there, they could have chosen many more humane methods of letting him know about it. Not to mention means that would cause less damage to the environment. Bernard and Frida had continued to burrow swiftly downwards, but as Frida disappeared from view, Bernard was stopped by the sound of Derek's clarinet. He ran back to his delinquent son. "Now is not the time for making a point," he said breathlessly. "We have to get as far away from here as possible." Derek put down his clarinet.
"I won't burrow," he said calmly.
"You must," Bernard urged. "It's your only option."
"Not my only option," Derek argued. He sighed heavily. "Of course I'm sad that I didn't have longer, but death is inevitable, and we only have a relatively brief 2.5-year lifespan at best."
"What are you saying?" said Bernard, suddenly frightened. "You can't mean this. Get digging! Come with me! We can talk later about... For goodness sake, get digging!" Derek looked resentfully at his worried father.
"I've made my decision," he said coldly. "Stop trying to control me."
The gas was now thick in the tunnel, and Bernard could feel his head clouding and his eyes watering. It was now or never. "I am trying to save your life!" he yelled.
"Call that living?"
sneered Derek. Bernard met those cool black eyes for one last time before turning and burrowing as fast as his claws could manage, pursued by the mournful sound of the clarinet. When, at last, he paused for breath, the air was clearer, and there was no sound at all in the darkness. The next year came. Bernard and Frida were blessed with a litter of 6 children. During their time in the nest, from their early, blind, naked days to the time that they were ready to leave home, they were told by Bernard and Frida all about Derek, and how his refusal to burrow had eventually caused his terrible death. The young moles listened with hushed awe to the tragic story. None of them could understand why he had been so foolish, and they were filled with pity for the older brother they had never known. They each silently vowed not to waste their own lives in such a pointless manner, and when they were ready to leave home, they enthusiastically threw themselves into burrowing far and wide. Bernard and Frida proudly watched their offspring go, watched them tunnelling and burrowing into the distance, just as they too would one day watch their own descendants leave the nest. All of them tunnelling and burrowing, day by day, like every other mole. You have been listening to Neurotic Literature, written and performed by me, James Lark. If you would like to support this podcast and more like it, and for goodness sake, why wouldn't you? You can do it financially at ko-fi.com/neurotic literature. But look, I'm not doing this for the money, I'm doing it for the fame and glory, so the best thing of all that you can do is tell all of your friends and family to listen as well. Then maybe I, like Derek, can feel that I have led a productive life.